My husband was in the shower when his phone lit up on our marble vanity. The message read, "Last night meant everything to me." I did not scream. I did not throw things. I picked up the device and texted back, "Come over, she is gone." The doorbell rang 20 minutes later, and I instantly knew my perfect life was a lie. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart someone who thought you were a fool. The steady drumming of hot water against the glass shower doors echoed through our master bathroom. Steam curled around the edges of the room, fogging up the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glittering Atlanta skyline. We lived in a stunning penthouse in Buckhead, the kind of home that screamed Black excellence and generational wealth. My husband Marcus was 35 years old and a highly successful investment fund manager. He was charming, impeccably dressed, and loved to be the center of attention. I am Nia, 32 years old, and together we were the power couple that everyone in our social circle admired. We attended the right charity galas, smiled for the right photographs, and played our parts perfectly. But standing there in my silk robe, the illusion of our flawless marriage shattered with a single soft chime. His phone was resting on the black marble counter. Marcus was always careful with his devices, but tonight he had forgotten to place it face down. The screen illuminated the dark room, cutting through the steam. The preview banner displayed a message from a number saved simply under an initial. The text read, "Last night meant everything to me." A normal wife might have banged on the shower door demanding answers. She might have collapsed onto the bathroom floor in tears, demanding to know why she was not enough. I am not a normal wife. I am a forensic accountant. I make my living dismantling complex corporate frauds, tracking hidden offshore accounts, and exposing the darkest financial secrets of the corporate elite. My entire career is built on the fact that numbers never lie, and human behavior always leaves a trail. You cannot hide millions of dollars from me, and you certainly cannot hide an affair. I smiled a cold, humorless smile. The sudden rush of adrenaline sharpened my senses. I picked up the phone. It was unlocked. Arrogance is always the downfall of a careless man. I tapped the screen, my fingers steady and precise. I did not type out a paragraph of rage. I matched the tone of someone confident and eagerly waiting. I typed, "Come over, she is gone." I hit send. I grabbed a soft microfiber towel and carefully wiped the screen, erasing any trace of my fingerprints. I placed the phone back on the marble counter, ensuring it sat exactly parallel to the edge of the sink, matching Marcus's obsessive-compulsive habits perfectly. I stepped back and took a deep breath. The hot water continued to run behind the frosted glass. Marcus was humming a low tune, completely unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. As a forensic accountant, you learn to look for discrepancies, the tiny variations in a spreadsheet that signal massive embezzlement. I had noticed the discrepancies in Marcus for months. The unexpected late nights at his investment firm, the sudden changes in his password habits, the unexplained cash withdrawals that did not match our joint financial statements, the mileage on his luxury car that did not align with his daily commute. When you analyze data for a living, you cannot help but audit your own life. I had been quietly observing, collecting mental notes, and waiting for the right moment. I treated his behavior like a suspicious balance sheet, knowing that eventually the numbers would fail to add up. The text message tonight was the missing receipt I needed to close the ledger. I walked out of the bathroom and moved into the expansive living room. The lights of Atlanta stretched out before me, a sea of golden potential shining through the floor-to-ceiling glass. I poured myself a glass of expensive red wine, watching the rich, dark liquid swirl against the crystal. I sat down gracefully on our emerald green velvet sofa and waited. The fabric was soft beneath my hands, a stark contrast to the cold calculation running through my mind. I thought about the man currently washing away his sins in my shower. Marcus loved the image we projected. He loved walking into high society events with me on his arm, showing the world that he had a brilliant, successful wife. But beneath that polished exterior was a man driven by ego and a desperate need for validation. I had spent years supporting his ambitions using my financial expertise to help structure his investments and secure his position. I had been the silent architect of his success, and this was how he repaid my loyalty. The clock on the wall ticked in perfect rhythm with my steady heartbeat. 10 minutes passed, then 15. I tracked the time with the precision of an auditor waiting for a crucial deadline. I took slow, measured sips of my wine, letting the complex flavors ground me in the present moment. I was not angry. Anger is an unpredictable emotion that clouds judgment. I was deeply, profoundly focused. Every scenario, every possible outcome calculated itself in my brain. I was building a case, and the final piece of evidence was currently in transit. The water in the bathroom finally shut off. I heard the sliding glass door open and the soft rustle of Marcus grabbing his towel. He was entirely oblivious, likely planning his next lie or rehearsing his next excuse for why he needed to leave the house again. Right at that exact second, the sharp, unmistakable chime of our private elevator echoed through the penthouse. The doorbell rang. The sound sliced through the quiet luxury of our home, ringing loud and clear in the silent apartment. Marcus called out from the bathroom, his voice echoing down the hallway, asking me who was at the door this late at night. I did not answer him. I took one final slow sip of my wine and set the glass down on the table. The paradox had begun. The trap was perfectly set. Someone had actually shown up to my invitation, and they were standing right outside my door. The real game was about to start, and I knew exactly how I was going to win. The heavy oak door swung open with a smooth, silent glide. The hallway lights cast a long shadow across the cold marble floor of the penthouse. There stood Chloe, not a random woman from a downtown Atlanta bar, not an anonymous client or a desperate groupie seeking a payday. My own flesh and blood, the golden child of our mother, the sister I had protected and shielded my entire life. The imaginary camera pans slowly from the polished floor up to her face. She was wearing a tan trench coat, wrapped hastily around her shivering body. The coat was slightly parted at the collar, revealing the delicate silk lace of a crimson nightgown beneath. Her signature ruby red lipstick was smudged just slightly at the corner of her mouth. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and terrified like a deer caught in the blinding headlights of an oncoming luxury sedan. Before she even opened her mouth to speak, the scent hit me. It was unmistakable. Tuscan Leather by Tom Ford. It was the exact custom blend Marcus ordered from London twice a year. The spicy, rich aroma hung heavily in the space between us, mixing sickeningly with Chloe's sweet vanilla lotion. The arithmetic of betrayal calculated perfectly in my mind. The numbers clicked into their devastating places. A forensic accountant does not need a confession when the physical evidence is screaming the truth. Chloe opened her mouth, her voice trembling as she struggled to form a coherent sentence. She stammered about a flat tire on the highway. She babbled a chaotic story about her husband Trent being out of town and her phone battery dying, forcing her to come up here for help. She spun this desperate web of fiction, forgetting completely that her own phone was tightly gripped in her left hand, its screen glowing brightly with late-night notifications. I stood perfectly still. I let her drown in her own pathetic lies. As an auditor of human deception, I am trained to spot the exact moment a fraudster realizes their ledger does not balance. I watched her eyes dart nervously toward the hallway leading to the master bedroom, where the sound of running water echoed through the quiet apartment. My posture remained relaxed. My face betrayed absolutely nothing. I did not scream. I did not raise my hand to strike her. Violence is the refuge of the inarticulate and the unprepared. I tilted my head, looking her up and down with a gaze that stripped away every ounce of her remaining pride. I took a slow step backward, gesturing elegantly toward the brilliantly lit living room. "Come in, little sister." I spoke the words with a terrifying calmness that chilled the air between us. "The sound of the shower is still running, as you can hear. Marcus is washing up." He did not tell me his multi-million-dollar investment fund was so incredibly busy that he had to personally take care of his sister-in-law in the middle of the night. The color drained entirely from Chloe's face, leaving her looking like a fragile porcelain doll. Her designer handbag slipped from her shoulder, hitting the marble floor with a dull thud. She stared at me, waiting for the screaming, the crying, the outrage that a lesser woman would deliver. She expected a physical fight. She expected me to lose my mind and cause a scene that she could later spin to our mother as an act of insane jealousy. But I gave her nothing but a chilling, serene smile. The silence stretched between us thick and suffocating. She realized in that exact moment that I was not a fool to be played. I was a predator who had just spotted my prey stepping into a carefully laid trap. Panic seized her completely. She scrambled backward, her expensive heels scraping awkwardly against the hallway tile. She did not bother picking up her bag. She turned and sprinted toward the private elevator, jabbing the call button frantically, as tears of absolute terror streamed down her perfectly contoured face. I stood in the doorway and watched the heavy metal doors slide shut, sealing away the pathetic sight of my own sister fleeing like a thief in the night. I reached down, picked up her abandoned handbag, and tossed it casually into the hall closet. I closed the front door just as the water in the master bathroom finally stopped. The heavy luxury of silence returned to the penthouse, broken only by the soft padding of Marcus walking barefoot across the bedroom carpet. I walked back toward our room, my footsteps entirely silent, my mind operating at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Every emotion was locked away in a secure mental vault. Right now, I needed to play the role of the devoted, oblivious wife. Marcus emerged from the hallway, a thick white towel slung low around his waist. Water droplets glistened on his athletic chest. He flashed that brilliant practice smile, the exact same smile that graced the covers of Atlanta financial magazines, the smile that convinced wealthy investors to hand over millions of dollars without asking too many questions. He walked up behind me as I stood in front of the massive vanity mirror, applying a layer of night cream. He wrapped his strong arms around my waist, pulling my back tightly against his damp chest. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, inhaling deeply. The overwhelming scent of his Tom Ford cologne filled my lungs, making my stomach churn with absolute disgust. He kissed my skin softly, lingering just long enough to perform the role of a perfect partner. "I love you most in the world, Naya." He whispered the lie with flawless execution. His voice was smooth, completely devoid of guilt or hesitation. He was a master of his craft, comfortable in his deceit, entirely convinced of his own invincibility. I looked at our reflection in the mirror. The imaginary camera slowly zooms in on our faces, capturing the chilling contrast of the moment. I looked at the handsome, successful husband holding his brilliant, dedicated wife. We looked like the ultimate portrait of power and romance in the elite circles of Atlanta. I looked deep into my own dark eyes and then smiled back at him through the glass. "I love you too, Marcus." I replied, my voice steady and sweet, betraying absolutely none of the venom coursing through my veins. I held his gaze in the mirror, feeling the freezing cold reality wash over me. I was sharing a life, a home, and a bed with a monster. A man who could violate the deepest trust and return home to kiss my neck without missing a beat. And the accomplice helping him tear my life apart, the woman wearing his cologne and sneaking through my hallways, was my own sister. The betrayal was not just a marital infidelity, it was a family conspiracy. The ultimate fraud had been perpetrated under my own roof. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They forgot exactly what I do for a living. The audit had officially begun, and I was going to systematically bankrupt them both. The thick scent of hickory smoke and expensive catered brisket hung heavy in the humid Sunday air. Less than 48 hours had passed since I watched my sister flee from my penthouse in a state of absolute terror. Now I was standing in the sprawling, manicured backyard of my mother's Buckhead estate. Vivian, our mother, treated her Sunday barbecues like royal court gatherings for Atlanta's black elite. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated with silver trays of champagne, while the gentle hum of a live jazz trio drifted over the sound of the cascading infinity pool. I stood quietly near the edge of the stone patio, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water, observing the spectacle unfolding before me. My mother was in her absolute element. Vivian wore a flowing silk caftan, her wrists heavy with diamond tennis bracelets that caught the afternoon sun. She was holding court with a group of affluent women from her country club, her voice carrying easily over the music. She wanted everyone to hear her. Nia just buries her face in those boring ledgers all day. Vivian laughed loudly, a sharp and grating sound that made my jaw tighten. Honestly, marrying Marcus was the blessing of 3 lifetimes for her. She would be completely lost without him guiding her. But look at Chloe and Trent over there. Just look at them. They are the absolute golden couple of Atlanta. I shifted my gaze to the golden couple. Chloe was draped in a pristine white sundress, clinging to her husband Trent's arm, flashing a picture-perfect smile at anyone who looked their way. It was a masterful performance from a woman who had been sneaking out of my husband's shower, wearing nothing but silk and deceit just 2 nights ago. Trent spotted me standing alone and decided to wander over, dragging Chloe along with him. Trent was a Silicon Valley transplant who loved to remind everyone that he was the smartest person in any room. He wore expensive loafers without socks, a linen shirt unbuttoned 1 clasp too low, and a patronizing smirk that he reserved exclusively for me. As an outsider who had married into our established family, he constantly felt the need to assert his dominance. "Nia still crunching those boring numbers on a Sunday?" Trent asked, pitching his voice loud enough to ensure the nearby guests were listening. He let out a condescending chuckle. "You auditors are just so incredibly risk-averse. It is honestly a little sad. You could never understand our multi-million-dollar disruptive startup mindset. We are changing the paradigm of the tech industry, taking leaps you could never even calculate on your little spreadsheets." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water. A disruptive startup mindset. That was a highly creative way to describe a hollow shell company that had already burned through 2 massive rounds of angel investments, with absolutely zero revenue to show for it. I had run the background checks on Trent's business months ago out of pure professional curiosity. His company was a financial sinkhole. Instead of arguing, I simply offered him a cool, knowing smirk. "Numbers always tell a story, Trent," I replied, my voice smooth and perfectly composed. "You just have to know how to read the bottom line before the bankruptcy auditors do." Trent's patronizing smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes flashing with sudden irritation. Before he could formulate a comeback, Marcus walked up behind me. My husband slid his hand around my waist, pulling me close, playing the role of the generous, successful patriarch to absolute perfection. The heavy scent of his Tuscan leather cologne washed over me, identical to the scent that had been clinging to my sister's skin. Marcus raised his glass of bourbon, tapping the side with a silver spoon, to command the attention of the patio. The chatter died down. The jazz trio stopped playing. All eyes turned to the man of the hour. "Listen up, everyone," Marcus announced, projecting his charismatic voice across the manicured lawn. "Family is about building a legacy together. It is about lifting each other up and securing our future. That is why I am incredibly proud to announce today that my investment fund is officially leading the Series A funding round for Trent's new tech venture. We are keeping the wealth right here in the family." A chorus of applause broke out across the patio. Chloe squealed with delight, throwing her arms around Marcus and hugging him tightly. Trent puffed out his chest, accepting the handshakes and congratulations from the surrounding guests. It was a beautiful display of family unity and financial triumph. But I was not looking at the celebrating trio. My eyes were fixed on my mother. Vivian stood on the opposite side of the patio. She was not clapping. She was not cheering. Instead, she locked eyes with Marcus over the rim of her champagne flute. It was not a look of maternal pride or happy surprise. It was a cold, deeply calculated exchange. A silent, heavy confirmation of a deal struck in the dark. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with deafening clarity. As a forensic accountant, I hunt for the hidden connections that explain the missing money. Marcus was not just sleeping with my sister for fun. He was funneling my family's wealth, the money I had helped secure and protect, into Trent's failing business. And my mother, the woman who had just called me a disappointment in front of half of Atlanta, was entirely in on the scheme. The infidelity was merely a symptom of a much larger rot. The real disease infecting my family was a massive orchestrated financial fraud, and they were using my marriage as the ultimate cover story. I smiled warmly at Marcus as he turned back to me, raising my glass of sparkling water to toast his generosity. They thought I was just a boring auditor blind to the world outside my spreadsheets. They had no idea that I was already auditing their destruction. My mother's manicured hand suddenly clamped onto my wrist. Her grip was tight, her perfectly filed acrylic nails biting into my skin, completely contradicting the breezy maternal smile she flashed at the passing guests. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a low, commanding hiss that brooked no argument. She told me we needed to speak in private immediately. I allowed her to guide me away from the sunlit patio, away from the jazz music and the clinking champagne flutes, and deep into the shadows of her sprawling estate. We entered her private study, a room suffocatingly decorated with dark mahogany, heavy velvet drapes, and walls lined with photographs that primarily featured Chloe. My mother shut the solid oak door behind us, the heavy click of the latch severing us from the party outside. The pleasant high society hostess vanished instantly. In her place stood the cold, calculating matriarch I had known my entire life. She walked over to her massive desk and picked up a sleek leather portfolio. She tossed it onto the polished wood between us. Read it and sign it, she ordered, tapping her diamond ring against the cover. I opened the folder. My eyes, trained to scan complex financial jargon, absorbed the text in seconds. It was a joint asset guarantee. A legally binding contract that would pledge my personal wealth, our shared estate, and the portfolio I had built before ever meeting Marcus as collateral to secure a massive line of credit for Trent's failing startup. Marcus was not just investing his fund's capital. He was attempting to quietly mortgage my entire life to bankroll his mistress's husband. I looked up from the document, keeping my face completely devoid of expression. I asked her why she would ever assume I would pledge my hard-earned assets to back a company that lacked a viable product, a clear revenue stream, and competent leadership. Vivian's eyes narrowed into angry slits. She slammed her hands down on the desk, leaning forward until I could smell the sharp mint of her breath. "You are the older sister," she spat out, every word laced with venom. "You have a responsibility to support her. Chloe is pregnant, she needs a secure future." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The heavy mahogany walls spun for a fraction of a second as the words hit me. Pregnant. Chloe was pregnant. A sickening jolt of adrenaline shot through my veins. Was it Trent's child? Or was it the child of the man currently standing out on the patio? The man who had been sneaking into my sister's bed while I analyzed corporate ledgers. The mathematical probability of Marcus being the father flashed through my mind, aligning perfectly with the timeline of his late nights and unexplained absences. I forced oxygen into my lungs, refusing to let my mother see the absolute devastation tearing through my chest. I looked down at the contract, then back up at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like a secondary citizen in my own family. "Trent is a liability," I stated evenly, pushing the leather folder back across the desk. "And I am not a charity fund. I will not sign this." My mother's face contorted with a rage so visceral it was almost frightening. She stepped around the desk, invading my personal space, her voice rising to a shrill crescendo. "You selfish, cold-blooded child!" she hissed, her finger jabbing at the air inches from my face. "You have always been exactly like this. Cold, calculating, entirely devoid of a heart. Your sister is bringing a new life into this world, and you cannot even sign a simple piece of paper to ensure her family does not fall apart. You are a bitter, jealous woman, Nia. You are lucky Marcus even tolerates your miserable presence." Before I could deliver the verbal dismantling she so desperately deserved, the heavy oak door swung open. Marcus stepped into the study, carrying his signature charm like a shield. He looked between my mother's flushed, angry face and my completely stoic expression. He immediately slipped into his role as the great peacemaker. "Now let us not raise our voices," Marcus said smoothly, gliding across the room to stand by my side. He placed a warm, heavy hand on my shoulder, feigning absolute devotion. He looked at me with those practiced, persuasive eyes. "Darling, it is just a formality," he murmured, his voice thick with false reassurance. "Trent's company is on the verge of a massive breakthrough. I have run the projections myself. I would never put our assets at risk if I did not believe in the return. We are just helping family get over a temporary hurdle. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored linen blazer to retrieve his custom Mont Blanc pen, intending to physically place it into my hand. As he pulled the pen free, his clumsy movement dislodged a folded piece of heavy textured cardstock. It slipped from his pocket and fluttered silently to the dark Persian rug beneath our feet. The room went completely still. Marcus froze, his charming smile faltering for a microsecond as his eyes darted to the floor. I moved faster than he did. I crouched down and picked up the thick paper. My thumb brushed over the embossed silver logo at the top. Cartier. It was a purchase receipt dated 2 days ago. My eyes scanned the itemized lines with the ruthless efficiency of an auditor. It was for a diamond-encrusted love bracelet. The exact, exorbitant, highly specific piece of jewelry that Chloe had been loudly whining about wanting during our mother's last luncheon. A piece that cost more than most people's annual salary. A piece that I certainly had never received. I stood back up, holding the receipt loosely between my fingers. Marcus was staring at me, his jaw tight, a bead of sweat suddenly forming at his temple. My mother looked back and forth between us, entirely unaware of the silent explosion that had just occurred. I looked at the receipt, then at Marcus, and finally at my mother. The rage inside me cooled into absolute terrifying ice. They wanted to play a game of hidden assets and secret liabilities. They wanted to steal my wealth to fund their twisted, incestuous reality. I folded the Cartier receipt perfectly in half and tucked it neatly back into the breast pocket of Marcus's blazer, patting the fabric smooth with a gentle, wifely touch. "You know how boring auditors can be, darling," I said, my voice dripping with honeyed poison. "I never sign complex financial guarantees without my independent counsel reviewing the fine print first. I will take a copy of this to my office on Monday." I did not wait for their protests. I turned on my heel and walked out of the heavy oak door, leaving them standing in the suffocating silence of the study. The pieces were all on the board. The golden sister was pregnant. The husband was financing the fraud with stolen diamonds. The mother was the ruthless enforcer. They thought they had backed me into a corner, but they had merely handed me the exact paper trail I needed to destroy them all. The ride back to the penthouse was a masterclass in silent warfare. Marcus drove with one hand draped casually over the steering wheel of his Porsche, humming along to the radio, entirely convinced he had successfully navigated the afternoon's tension. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the passing city lights, playing the role of the exhausted, overworked wife. I let him believe his smooth talk in the study had pacified me. I let him believe the Cartier receipt was just a momentary blip that I would forget by morning. I waited until 2 in the morning. The heavy rhythmic sound of Marcus snoring filled the master bedroom. I slipped out from under the silk duvet, my bare feet completely silent on the hardwood floor. I did not turn on a single light. I navigated the familiar layout of our penthouse by memory, slipping into Marcus's private home office and pulling the heavy door shut behind me. His laptop sat on the center of his glass desk, sleeping quietly. Marcus was an arrogant man, and arrogant men always underestimate the people they live with. He thought his biometric locks and dual-factor authentication made his digital life impenetrable. He forgot that I was a senior forensic auditor who dealt with corporate embezzlement cases for a living. I did not need to hack his passwords. I simply needed to bypass his user interface. I connected my personal encrypted flash drive to his port, booting the machine through an external operating system I had configured months ago for a massive corporate fraud case. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh pale blue light across my face. Within 4 minutes, I was completely bypassing his admin controls and staring directly into the raw directory of his hard drive. I opened the folder labeled with Trent's startup name, Apex Solutions. Marcus had presented this company to our family and to his investors as a cutting-edge tech firm on the verge of revolutionizing logistics. I pulled up his financial models, his glowing quarterly projections, and his signed investment authorizations. Then I opened a secure browser window and logged directly into the Federal Corporate Registry database using my professional credentials. I typed in the exact tax identification number Marcus had listed for Trent's company. The search results loaded instantly. Status dissolved. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes tracing the lines of legal text. Trent had not just failed to launch a product. Apex Solutions had formally filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy exactly 2 years ago. The company did not exist. It was a phantom, a legally dead entity that produced absolutely nothing but debt. A freezing sensation washed over my skin. If Trent's company had been dead for 24 months, where exactly did the money go? I toggled back to Marcus's financial ledgers. 3 months ago, Marcus had authorized a wire transfer of exactly $3 million from our joint investment portfolio. He had categorized it as the lead investment in Trent's Series A funding round. I pulled the raw routing data from his outgoing wire log. I traced the sequence of numbers following the digital breadcrumbs across the globe. The $3 million never went to a corporate account in Silicon Valley. It bypassed California entirely. The funds had been wired to a shell company in the Cayman Islands, bounced through a holding firm in Delaware, and then quietly deposited into a private domestic family trust. A trust that I did not recognize. I was staring at a highly sophisticated, meticulously planned embezzlement scheme. Marcus was bleeding our joint accounts dry, using Trent's dead company as the perfect excuse to drain millions of dollars into the shadows. As I sat there calculating the sheer scale of the theft, a small icon bounced at the bottom right corner of Marcus's screen. It was a push notification from an encrypted secondary email client that Marcus ran silently in the background. My bypass software had forced the application to remain open. A new message had just arrived. The sender name was not an anonymous business partner. It was an email address I knew perfectly well. It was Vivian, my own mother. I clicked the notification, opening the message string. The words glowed against the dark background, burning themselves permanently into my memory. The transfer for Chloe's share cleared this evening. Just keep the girl safe and comfortable. Nia is far too blind to ever figure this out. She only sees what we let her see. I stopped breathing. The hum of the computer fan suddenly sounded deafening in the quiet room. I read the words again, and then a third time. My mother was not just aware of the affair. She was not just turning a blind eye to Marcus sleeping with my sister. My mother was the financial architect of the entire operation. Vivian was actively conspiring with my husband to steal the wealth I had built, laundering it through a fake startup to fund my sister's lavish lifestyle and her new illegitimate pregnancy. They had weaponized my marriage to build a golden parachute for Chloe, treating my life's work like a personal ATM. The betrayal was so absolute, so profoundly vicious, that it transcended simple anger. This was not just a cheating husband or an entitled sister. This was my own flesh and blood, the woman who gave birth to me, orchestrating my financial and emotional ruin with the clinical precision of a cartel boss. She thought I was nothing but a blind, obedient workhorse, useful only for generating wealth to be harvested by the favorites of the family. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was a biological response to pain, and I was no longer in pain. I was at war. I highlighted the entire email thread, the wire transfer logs, and the bankruptcy filings. With a few swift keystrokes, I copied every single byte of evidence onto my encrypted flash drive. I closed the applications, wiped my digital footprint from his operating system, and shut the laptop down. The screen faded to black, plunging the room back into darkness. I pulled the flash drive from the port and closed my hand tightly around it. The sharp plastic edges dug into my palm, grounding me in reality. Vivian and Marcus thought they were playing a brilliant game of chess. They forgot that I was the one who controlled the board. I was going to let them celebrate their fake investments and their stolen jewelry for just a little while longer. I was going to let them feel invincible. And then I was going to burn their entire kingdom to the ground. The sun had barely broken over the Atlanta skyline when I swiped my keycard at the glass doors of my firm. Monday morning was usually a time for easing into the week, but today, my office was a war room. I locked the door behind me, closed the blinds, and plugged the encrypted flash drive into my secure workstation. The dual monitors flared to life, illuminating my face with the stark, unforgiving light of absolute truth. I was no longer a betrayed wife or a scorned sister. I was a senior forensic auditor, and I had a carcass to dissect. I spent the next 8 hours building a digital map of Marcus's deceit. Forensic accounting is not just about crunching numbers. It is about understanding the psychology of the thief. Fraudsters always leave a fingerprint, a distinct pattern of arrogance that eventually brings them down. Marcus thought his pattern was invisible because he hid it behind the chaotic, high-risk world of tech startups. I opened the master ledger for our joint investment portfolio and cross-referenced it with the data I had pulled from his laptop. The scale of the embezzlement was breathtaking. Marcus had not just diverted a single $3 million wire. That was merely the latest and largest theft. I found a trail of monthly deductions dating back precisely 2 years, coinciding perfectly with the exact month Chloe and Trent had moved back to Atlanta. The transactions were brilliantly camouflaged. Marcus had categorized them as seed capital server maintenance, aggressive marketing allocations, and offshore developer retainers for Trent's company, Apex Solutions. To a standard accountant, these looked like the typical massive cash burns of a Silicon Valley venture trying to scale too fast. But to me, they were glaring red flags. I followed the money. I tracked a specific $500,000 transfer labeled as an aggressive server farm acquisition. The money left our joint account, hit the Apex Solutions corporate account for exactly 4 hours, and then vanished. It was wired out as a consulting fee to a vendor in the Cayman Islands. From there, it was broken into dozens of smaller randomized deposits that flowed back into the United States, specifically into a Delaware limited liability company named Emerald Horizon Holdings. Delaware LLCs are notoriously secretive, designed to shield the identities of their owners. But Marcus had made a fatal error. He had used his own private wealth management software to generate the annual tax reporting for Emerald Horizon. I pulled the federal tax identification number and matched it to the encrypted correspondence between Marcus and my mother. Emerald Horizon Holdings was not a corporate vendor. It was a blind trust, and the sole exclusive beneficiary of that trust was Chloe. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, letting the sheer audacity of the scheme wash over me. Every single dollar Marcus claimed to be investing in Trent's revolutionary tech company was actually being funneled directly into Chloe's private bank accounts. The supposed tech startup was nothing but an elaborate, highly functioning washing machine for stolen cash. My mother, acting as the silent trustee, was managing the distributions, ensuring Chloe could afford her designer clothes, her luxury vehicles, and her country club lifestyle without ever having to answer a single question about where the money came from. But the most fascinating puzzle piece was Trent. I pulled up the corporate governance documents for Apex Solutions. I scrutinized the board minutes, the operating agreements, and the signatory authorizations. Trent was listed as the chief executive officer and the visionary founder. His signature was plastered across every single federal tax return, every bank loan application, and every fraudulent vendor invoice. Yet when I examined the actual banking permissions, a chilling reality emerged. Trent had zero administrative access to the company's capital. Marcus, acting as the lead venture capitalist, retained sole dual authentication control over the wire transfers. Trent could not move a single dime without Marcus executing the transaction. A dark, deeply satisfied smile spread across my face. Trent had absolutely no idea. The arrogant, condescending Silicon Valley hotshot who had mocked my auditing career just 24 hours ago was completely oblivious to the reality of his own existence. He genuinely believed he was a brilliant tech pioneer. He actually thought Marcus was investing millions of dollars because his business model was disruptive and revolutionary. He strutted around Atlanta in his custom loafers, bragging about his startup mindset, entirely blind to the fact that his company had no product, no clients, and had been legally bankrupt for 2 years. Trent was not a mastermind. He was a useful idiot, a perfectly cast puppet. Marcus and my mother needed a plausible front for their money laundering operation. They needed someone who looked the part, someone arrogant enough to talk a big game, but clueless enough never to check the actual accounting ledgers. The white tech bro with a big ego and a failing business was the ultimate human shield. If the Internal Revenue Service or the Securities and Exchange Commission ever caught wind of the missing millions, they would follow the paper trail straight to Apex Solutions. They would see Trent's signature on every fraudulent document. Trent would be the one dragged out of his mansion in handcuffs. He would face decades in federal prison for massive corporate fraud, while Marcus, Vivian, and Chloe safely, legally, and completely walked away with all the cash securely hidden in Delaware. They had set him up to be the ultimate fall guy, and he was too busy admiring his own reflection to notice the noose tightening around his neck. I printed the routing numbers, the forged invoices, and the trust fund beneficiary documents. The heavy printer in the corner of my office hummed as it produced stack after stack of undeniable, irrefutable proof. I gathered the warm pages and arranged them into perfect sequential order. I slid them into a thick red binder. My family had built a labyrinth of lies, assuming I was too trusting, too loyal, and too boring to ever look behind the walls. They thought they had secured their future by sacrificing mine. But they had handed a loaded gun to the best forensic auditor in the state of Georgia. I locked the red binder in my secure filing cabinet. I packed my briefcase, smoothed the wrinkles from my tailored pencil skirt, and walked out of my office. The audit was complete. It was time to schedule the final presentation. The red binder sitting securely in my filing cabinet was only the foundation of my case. I had proven the existence of the Delaware Blind Trust. I had proven that Trent's company was a legally dead phantom used solely to launder capital. But to bring this entire scheme crashing down with catastrophic legal force, I needed to know exactly what the Emerald Horizon Trust was purchasing. Cash sitting idle in a corporate account was one thing, but Marcus and my mother were not the type to sit on liquid assets. They operated on ego, and ego demanded monuments. It was Wednesday evening. Marcus had texted me earlier that afternoon, claiming he was locked in a grueling high-stakes board meeting and would not return to the penthouse until well past midnight. The apartment was completely silent. I sat at his glass desk once again, the encrypted flash drive glowing softly as my bypass software overrode his security protocols for the second time. I accessed the trust's outgoing wire logs. A massive singular payment had cleared just 4 weeks ago. $5.2 million. The recipient was not a tech vendor or a consulting firm. It was a premier luxury real estate holding group based right here in Georgia. I immediately cross-referenced the transaction identification number with the county property registry database. The search engine spun for 3 seconds before delivering a pristine PDF copy of the property deed. I stared at the glowing monitor, my blood running colder than liquid nitrogen. It was a tri-level penthouse in Midtown Atlanta, located less than 3 miles from where I was currently sitting. The architectural specs were attached. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a private rooftop pool, dedicated elevator access, and a custom nursery. A spectacular multi-million-dollar palace in the sky. And right there, printed clearly on the bottom line of the warranty deed, was the sole registered owner, Chloe. The arithmetic of their depravity was staggering. The betrayal was no longer just a financial crime. It was a deeply personal, grotesque masterpiece of family treachery. My mother, Vivian, acting as the trustee, had actively authorized the release of my stolen money to purchase a sprawling love nest for my sister and my husband. They were building an entire alternate reality, a secret second family fully funded by the wealth I had spent my entire adult life accumulating. Every late night I spent auditing corporate mergers, every weekend I sacrificed to build my firm, every bonus I deposited into our joint accounts had been systematically siphoned off. They used my blood, sweat, and intellect to buy Chloe a private rooftop pool and a nursery for her illegitimate child. Vivian had looked me in the eye at that Sunday barbecue and demanded I sign away my future to protect Chloe. She had called me a cold-blooded child. The sheer hypocrisy tasted like battery acid in the back of my throat. My mother was the ultimate parasite, feeding her favored golden child with the financial lifeblood of the daughter she secretly despised. She was using my money to finance the ultimate humiliation. I felt a dangerous, terrifying calm wash over me. The kind of calm that precedes absolute destruction. I dragged the property deeds, the closing signatures, and the escrow wire confirmations into my secure desktop folder. I clicked the transfer button to copy the files directly to my encrypted USB drive. A progress bar popped up on the center of the screen. Calculating time remaining, 2 minutes. The silence of our penthouse was absolute. The only sound was the soft rhythmic hum of Marcus's laptop processing the heavy encrypted data files. I watched the green bar creep slowly to the right. 10%, 20%. I leaned back in the leather chair, taking a slow, measured breath. I pictured the Midtown penthouse. I pictured Chloe standing on her new balcony, wearing her Cartier bracelet, waiting for my husband to arrive. I pictured my mother visiting them, admiring the skyline view, patting Chloe's pregnant stomach, and congratulating herself on a scheme perfectly executed. They felt so incredibly safe. They thought they were untouchable. 50%. Then a sound shattered the quiet. It was sharp and unmistakable. The heavy metallic clack of a key sliding into the front door's deadbolt. My heart slammed against my ribs. I froze my eyes, darting to the digital clock on the bottom of the screen. It was barely 9 o'clock. Marcus was supposed to be gone for another 3 hours. The board meeting must have ended early, or it never existed in the first place. The heavy oak door swung open with a muted thud. I could hear the familiar scuff of his expensive leather shoes stepping onto the marble entryway of the foyer. 65%. My mind raced through the permutations of survival. If he caught me in his private office, logged into his secure desktop with a foreign operating system, the game was entirely over. He would instantly realize I knew everything. He would drain the remaining joint accounts, move the money offshore permanently, and file for divorce before I could launch a coordinated legal strike. The element of surprise was my only weapon, and it was currently hanging by a thread. 75%. Nia, Marcus called out. His voice echoed down the long hallway, loud and cheerful. Darling, I am home early. Are you in bed? I stared at the progress bar. It felt like it was crawling through wet cement. 80%. I heard the clatter of his keys being tossed onto the console table. He was moving. His footsteps shifted from the marble foyer to the hardwood floor of the main corridor. He was heading directly toward the master suite. His office was right next to our bedroom door. Nia, he called again, his voice slightly louder, closer now. 85%. I reached out, my fingers hovering over the USB drive. Pulling it out now would immediately corrupt the data. I needed the closing documents. I needed the undeniable proof of Vivian's signature on the trust release forms. Without those specific pages, my mother could play the victim and pretend Marcus acted alone. I needed every single bite of evidence. 90%. The footsteps grew louder. He was passing the kitchen. He would be at the office door in less than 10 seconds. I grabbed my phone with my left hand, unlocking the screen, pulling up a generic lifestyle article to use as a visual prop. 95%. The brass handle of the office door began to turn. 100%. Transfer complete. I ripped the flash drive from the port. In the exact same fraction of a second, I slammed the laptop shut. The glowing screen vanished just as the heavy office door swung completely open. Marcus stood in the doorway. His tie loosened, his suit jacket slung casually over one shoulder. He looked at me sitting behind his desk in the pitch-black room. A flicker of deep suspicion crossed his face, his eyes darting to his closed laptop and then back to my silhouette. I did not miss a single beat. I held up my phone, the bright screen illuminating my face, casting a soft, harmless glow in the dark office. Marcus, I said, my voice completely relaxed, laced with a perfect hint of sleepy surprise. You startled me. I thought you were stuck at the firm until midnight. He flipped the brass wall switch. The sudden glare of the overhead recessed lighting forced me to squint conveniently, masking the adrenaline spiking behind my eyes. He did not look at the laptop. His mind was entirely focused on his own performance. He walked past me, his expensive cologne filling the confined space of the office, and dropped his leather briefcase onto the floor with a heavy, deliberate thud. Plans changed, he said. His voice was stripped of the cheerful greeting from the hallway. The warmth was gone, replaced by a chilling, clinical detachment. I slipped my left hand under the edge of the desk, letting the encrypted USB drive slide silently from my palm into the deep pocket of my wool skirt. I kept my phone raised, locking the screen and setting it face down on the glass. Is everything all right? I asked, pitching my voice to perfectly mimic the concern of a tired, oblivious spouse. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he unbuttoned his suit jacket, reached into the inner breast pocket and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope. He tossed it onto the glass surface of the desk. It landed with a definitive slap right next to his closed laptop. "Open it," he commanded. I looked at the thick manila envelope, then up at his face. His jaw was set, his eyes hard and completely devoid of affection. He was looking at me the way an executive looks at an underperforming employee right before a termination meeting. "What is this, Marcus?" "It is the end of an era," he replied, leaning back against the leather sofa across the room and crossing his arms. "Read it." I picked up the envelope, broke the seal, and slid the heavy parchment papers out. The bold black font at the top of the first page screamed up at me. "Petition for dissolution of marriage." I kept my breathing perfectly even. I had fully expected a divorce. Eventually, probably once he and my mother had drained enough cash to ensure Chloe was set for life, but I had not expected him to strike first. He was preempting me. He wanted to control the narrative of the separation just as tightly as he controlled the fraudulent bank accounts. "You are filing for divorce," I stated, keeping my tone perfectly flat. "I am saving us both from a miserable existence," he countered, his voice rising, filling the room with rehearsed indignation. "I cannot do this anymore, Nia. I refuse to spend another year chained to a woman who is married to her spreadsheets. You are a workaholic. You are emotionally vacant. Living with you is like living in a freezer. You have neglected this marriage, you have neglected me, and frankly, your constant need for control is borderline abusive. I am suffocating in this house." It was a breathtaking display of narcissistic projection. The man who had been sleeping with my sister, buying her luxury penthouses, and laundering millions of dollars through a fake tech startup with my mother, was standing in his custom Italian suit, playing the battered, neglected husband. He was trying to gaslight me into taking the blame for the collapse of a marriage he had been dismantling for 2 years. I let him talk. I let him lay out his absurd, self-righteous narrative. "You want out," I said quietly, setting the petition back on the desk and resting my hands in my lap. "Fine. We can sell the penthouse and divide the assets. The investment portfolio is joint. We can handle this quietly." Marcus let out a sharp, condescending laugh. It was a grating sound that echoed off the glass walls. "Read page 4, Nia." I picked up the document again and flipped through the dense legal jargon until I reached the division of assets clause. The numbers jumped off the page, aggressive and unapologetic. He was not asking for an equitable split. He was demanding a 70-30 division of all marital assets, heavily favoring him. The petition stipulated that he retained full ownership of the penthouse, sole control of our primary investment portfolios, and majority shares in our offshore holdings. 70%, I read aloud, looking back up at him. "You want 70% of everything I have worked for over the last decade." "I want what I deserve." He snapped, his mask of the aggrieved husband slipping to reveal the greedy opportunist beneath. "I managed the investments. I took the risks. I dealt with the high-yield portfolios while you were busy checking other people's math. You audited wealth, Nia. I created it. My ventures generated the capital that allows us to live like this. You are going to sign those papers, and you are going to walk away quietly with your 30%. "And if I do not?" I asked, leaning back in his chair, deliberately mirroring his arrogant posture. "If I decide to hire my own legal counsel and tear into those high-yield portfolios you claim to have managed so brilliantly? If I demand a full, transparent audit of every single venture you funded during our marriage?" Marcus smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a predator cornering its prey. He walked back across the room, leaning close, planting both hands flat on the glass desk and invading my physical space. "You are not going to fight me, Nia," he whispered, his voice dangerously soft and laced with absolute certainty. "Because if you do not sign that agreement by Friday, I will completely destroy your career." I raised an eyebrow, maintaining my stoic facade while my mind raced. "My career is bulletproof, Marcus. You know that." "Nobody is bulletproof," he replied. His eyes locked onto mine with vicious intensity, especially not a senior forensic auditor whose entire reputation relies on absolute, unquestionable integrity. "You see, while you were busy neglecting our marriage, I was paying very close attention to your work habits. You frequently bring files home. You connect to our unsecured home network. I have compiled a very convincing, very thorough digital trail that shows you have been accepting under-the-table kickbacks to manipulate audit reports for two of your largest corporate clients. My blood ran cold. It was not out of fear, but out of pure, unadulterated shock at the depths of his depravity. He was not just stealing from me. He was prepared to frame me for a federal crime to ensure his getaway was flawless. That is a lie, I said evenly. I have never falsified a report in my life. I have never taken a kickback. It does not matter what the truth is. Marcus sneered, standing tall again, radiating triumph. It only matters what I can prove in a court of law. And I have fabricated an immaculate paper trail. I set up offshore accounts in your name, using your personal identification data. I doctored email chains between you and corporate executives. I manipulated the metadata on your own hard drive. It is an absolute masterpiece of digital framing. If you contest this divorce, if you try to claim one dime more than the 30% I am generously offering you, I will send that file to the Ethics Board, the State Licensing Commission, and the federal authorities. He leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a lethal hiss. You will not just lose your license, Nia. You will go to federal prison. Your firm will disown you. Your reputation will be shredded. You will have absolutely nothing. He reached down and tapped the divorce petition with his index finger, the sound sharp against the quiet hum of the room. You are going to sign this. You are going to take your 30%, and you are going to disappear. Do not try to outsmart me. Do not talk to a lawyer. Just sign the damn papers. Because if you make a single sound, if you cause 1 ounce of trouble, I will end you. He did not wait for a response. He turned on his heel, grabbed his briefcase from the floor, and walked out of the office. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, sealing me back into the silence. I sat alone in the bright room, staring at the divorce petition. My hand slipped into my pocket, my fingers tracing the sharp plastic edges of the encrypted flash drive. Marcus thought he was a genius. He thought his fabricated evidence was the ultimate trump card that would force me into submission. He was threatening me with a fake financial crime while completely oblivious to the fact that I was currently holding the absolute proof of his real one. I did not feel defeated. I felt liberated. Marcus had just handed me the final piece of the puzzle. He had drawn the battle lines, declared war, and promised absolute destruction. He wanted to play a game of mutually assured destruction, completely unaware that I was the one holding the nuclear launch codes. Marcus was halfway down the corridor when I let out a sharp, ragged gasp. I forced my hands to tremble. I forced my breathing to become shallow and frantic. I grabbed the divorce petition from the glass desk and stumbled out of the dark office, catching up to him just as his hand touched the heavy brass doorknob of the front door. "Marcus, wait!" I cried out, letting my voice crack perfectly. He stopped. He did not turn around immediately. I could actually see his shoulders relax as he absorbed the sound of my manufactured panic. When he finally turned to face me, a look of utter supreme satisfaction was painted across his handsome features. He looked like a conqueror surveying a burning city. "My license," I stammered, holding the thick stack of legal papers against my chest, as if they were a physical shield. "You cannot send that file to the board. You know exactly how hard I worked for my credentials. If the ethics committee gets an anonymous tip packed with fabricated metadata, they will suspend my practice immediately pending a full investigation. It would completely destroy my firm. My clients would vanish overnight." Marcus tilted his head, his eyes gleaming with the intoxicating thrill of total domination. He was reveling in my absolute defeat, soaking in the desperation of a woman he believed he had finally broken. "Then make the smart choice, Nia," he said smoothly, adjusting the cuffs of his Italian suit. "I am not an unreasonable man. I simply want what is rightfully mine. Sign the agreement right now. You keep your pristine reputation, you keep your little accounting firm, and you walk away with your 30%. We never have to see each other again, and your career remains completely untouched." I let my shoulders slump in a display of absolute crushing defeat. I walked over to the marble kitchen island, grabbed a heavy silver pen from the drawer, and flipped directly to the final page of the petition. I did not hesitate. I did not pretend to read the fine print or argue over the percentages. I signed my name with a violently shaking hand, initialing every required margin and clause. With those strokes of ink, I was legally surrendering 70% of our joint liquid assets, our massive stock portfolios, and my entire claim to the luxury penthouse we were currently standing in. I slid the signed document across the cool marble counter. Marcus picked it up, inspecting my signature with the meticulous, cautious care of a jeweler examining a newly acquired diamond. He smiled, tapped the papers against the granite to align the edges perfectly, and slipped them securely into his leather briefcase. "A pleasure doing business with you," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. He did not even bother to say goodbye. He simply opened the front door and walked out into the humid Atlanta night, undoubtedly heading straight to Midtown to celebrate his magnificent, flawless victory with my sister. The heavy lock clicked shut. My trembling hands instantly went perfectly still. My breathing leveled out into a slow, calm rhythm. I straightened my posture, rolling my neck until the tension released with a sharp, satisfying crack. I walked back into his office, pulled my encrypted flash drive from my skirt pocket, and plugged it directly into my own secure laptop. Marcus was an absolute fool. He had spent the last 2 years hyper-focused on draining our joint accounts, assuming that because he controlled the visible marital assets, he completely controlled me. He had entirely ignored the fact that long before I ever married him, I was a highly sought-after independent forensic auditor who commanded massive retainers from international corporate clients. I had an offshore corporate account in the Isle of Man that I had established a decade ago. It was fully tax compliant, entirely legal, and something Marcus knew absolutely nothing about. I opened a secure encrypted messaging protocol and initiated a direct connection to a private commercial debt broker operating out of Chicago. While analyzing the raw data from Marcus's laptop earlier that evening, I had discovered a glaring fatal anomaly in the Apex Solutions master ledger. Marcus and Vivian had needed $5.2 million in liquid cash to close on Chloe's luxury penthouse. However, they could not simply wire that massive amount directly from our joint accounts without immediately triggering federal money laundering alerts and bank freezes. They needed a bridge loan to wash the funds cleanly through the corporate entity. Marcus had orchestrated a masterpiece of predatory finance. He had gone to a private shadow banking syndicate. These were ruthless lenders who operated far outside traditional banking regulations, providing massive amounts of fast, untraceable cash at extortionate interest rates. Marcus had secured a $5 million short-term mezzanine loan for Apex Solutions, but Marcus was too smart to sign the promissory note himself. He had his puppet do it. Trent, believing this was a standard venture capital bridge loan to fund his imaginary tech expansion, had eagerly signed the master lending agreement. He had pledged the entire corporate entity of Apex Solutions as collateral. More importantly, fueled by his blinding arrogance and absolute faith in Marcus, Trent had signed an unconditional personal guarantee. The debt was incredibly toxic. The shadow syndicate holding the paper did not care about tech startups or software development. They only cared about their astronomical returns. If the loan defaulted, they would legally seize Apex Solutions, liquidate its assets, and ruthlessly go after Trent's personal wealth to satisfy the balance. I typed a rapid, precise message to the Chicago broker. I provided the exact tracking number and federal identifier of the Apex Solutions promissory note. "I want to purchase this specific paper," I typed into the secure terminal. "I require immediate total assignment of all rights, liens, and guarantees. I am wiring the principal balance plus a 20% premium for the inconvenience of a midnight transfer. Execute the transaction immediately." The broker responded within 2 minutes. Shadow lenders were always highly motivated to offload high-risk corporate paper for an immediate guaranteed cash premium. I logged directly into my Isle of Man portal. I authorized the international wire transfer. $6 million of my own private hidden wealth vanished into the digital ether. It was a massive financial gamble, a sum of money that would make any rational accountant lose their mind. But I was not spending money. I was purchasing a weapon of mass destruction. 15 minutes later, a heavy encrypted PDF document arrived in my secure inbox. It was the fully executed deed of assignment bearing the digital seals of the syndicate. I leaned back in the dark office and stared at the glowing monitor. Marcus thought he had just won the ultimate final victory. By forcing me to sign that divorce petition under duress, he had legally claimed 70% of our joint assets. He genuinely believed he was walking away with millions of dollars in clean, legally separated cash, entirely free to live like a king with my sister, in a spectacular penthouse bought with my money. He had absolutely no idea how the steel trap had just snapped completely shut around his throat. By purchasing that specific debt instrument, I was now the sole legal creditor of Apex Solutions. I owned the $5 million note. Trent owed me the money. Apex owed me the money. And because Marcus had used the Apex corporate accounts to funnel that exact cash into Chloe's blind trust to buy the penthouse, that real estate was now legally considered an asset purchased with stolen corporate funds. Funds that I now exclusively controlled. I was no longer just an aggrieved, soon-to-be ex-wife fighting for scraps in a slow, tedious family court. I was a senior corporate creditor equipped with the full terrifying power of federal commercial collection law at my immediate disposal. Marcus had fought viciously and fought dirty to win 70% of our marital assets. He simply did not realize that family court settlements are entirely subordinate to federal corporate debt. I had just positioned myself to legally freeze and seize 100% of his new life. I owned the fake tech company. I owned Trent's personal guarantee. And by direct, unavoidable financial extension, I owned the deed to Chloe's Midtown Palace. I printed the deed of assignment. The printer hummed quietly as the warm pages slid into the tray. I gathered them up and placed them into the red binder right next to the undeniable evidence of their embezzlement scheme. I closed the heavy binder and ran my hand over the smooth cover. Let Marcus celebrate his brilliant divorce settlement tonight. Let my mother toast to her own strategic genius. Let Chloe decorate her stolen nursery. They had 48 hours of blissful ignorance left, because on Friday morning I was going to call in the debt. The official arbitration hearing was scheduled for Friday morning at a prestigious family law firm in downtown Atlanta. The conference room was a suffocating expanse of dark mahogany beige leather and frosted glass. It was designed to intimidate, to make the dismantling of a marriage feel as clinical and inevitable as a corporate merger. I sat at the long table with my hands folded perfectly in my lap. I wore a modest gray suit, my hair pulled back completely devoid of makeup to accentuate the dark circles under my eyes. I looked exactly like what Marcus needed me to be, a broken, exhausted woman who had finally surrendered. Marcus sat across this table. He was practically vibrating with arrogant energy, flanked by two high-priced divorce attorneys who looked like sharks smelling blood in the water. Marcus wore a bespoke navy suit, a silk tie, and a faint, contemptuous smile. He had spent the last 48 hours believing he had successfully terrorized me into submission. He thought my silence was the product of fear. The mediator, a retired superior court judge named Hawthorne, cleared his throat and adjusted his reading glasses. We were there to formalize the separation agreement I had signed under duress in Marcus's office. But Marcus was not satisfied with just 70% of our liquid assets and the offshore portfolios. He wanted absolute total victory. He wanted the crown jewel of our marital estate, the sprawling custom-built mansion in Buckhead that we had purchased 3 years ago. Before the judge could even address the property division, the heavy glass doors of the conference room swung open. I turned my head, forcing my expression to register shock. My mother walked into the room. Vivian wore a tailored Chanel dress, her hair perfectly coiffed, carrying a designer handbag purchased with my laundered money. She did not look at me. She walked straight over to Marcus's side of the table and placed a comforting maternal hand on his shoulder. Marcus reached up and patted her hand, playing the role of the beleaguered, grateful son-in-law to absolute perfection. Judge Hawthorne looked up, clearly displeased by the interruption. "Excuse me, ma'am. This is a closed arbitration." Vivian stepped forward, her posture radiating absolute, unwavering righteousness. "I am here as a character witness for Marcus, Your Honor. I am Vivian Nia's mother, and I have a statement that needs to be entered into the official record regarding the division of the Buckhead estate." My own lawyer, a quiet junior partner I had hired purely for appearances, leaned toward me and whispered that we could object. I shook my head, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. Let her speak, I murmured, my voice trembling perfectly. Judge Hawthorne frowned, but nodded, granting her the floor. Vivian took a deep breath. She looked at the judge, then at Marcus, and finally she turned her cold, calculating gaze directly onto me. The performance she delivered was a masterclass in psychological warfare. She did not yell. She did not scream. She spoke with the quiet, devastating sorrow of a mother who had been pushed to her absolute limit. I love my daughter Vivian, began, her voice breaking with manufactured grief. But I cannot sit by and watch a good man be destroyed by her greed. Marcus has been nothing but a devoted, loving husband. He built a life for Nia. He gave her everything, and in return, she gave him nothing but coldness. She paused, dabbing the corner of her eye with a pristine tissue. Nia is completely obsessed with her career. Vivian continued, her words landing like precise knife strikes. She is a forensic auditor, and she treats her marriage like a spreadsheet. She is emotionally vacant. She has neglected Marcus for years, refusing to build a family, refusing to be a partner. And now she wants to drag this out and fight him for the Buckhead mansion. A home she never even wanted to make a home. I am ashamed. I am deeply, profoundly ashamed to have given birth to a daughter who only cares about money and completely neglects her husband. Marcus deserves that house. He deserves to start over without her vindictive interference. The silence in the room was absolute. Even Marcus's shark-like attorneys looked slightly taken aback by the sheer brutality of a mother publicly eviscerating her own child in a legal proceeding. I kept my head bowed. Inside, my mind was functioning with the cold, frictionless efficiency of a supercomputer. Vivian was magnificent. She was using her status as my mother to completely destroy my credibility, ensuring the judge would view me as a hostile, greedy antagonist. She was securing the Buckhead mansion for Marcus because she knew that keeping Marcus wealthy kept Chloe's cash flow completely secure. Vivian was protecting her investment, and she was using my heart as the stepping stone. It was time for me to deliver my own performance. I let out a sharp, ragged sob. I covered my face with my hands, my shoulders shaking violently. I forced the tears to well up, letting them spill over my cheeks and drip onto the polished mahogany table. The sound of my weeping echoed in the sterile room, raw and pathetic. Please, I gasped, peering through my fingers, looking directly at the judge. Please, just stop. I cannot do this anymore. My junior attorney touched my arm, trying to calm me down, but I pulled away. I looked at Marcus. He was practically glowing. His chest was puffed out and the smirk on his face was so wide it looked painful. Beside him, Vivian stood tall, her eyes flashing with triumphant, vicious satisfaction. They had broken me. That was the narrative playing out in their heads. They had finally crushed the difficult, stubborn daughter into total submission. Take it! I cried out, my voice thick with tears, pushing the property deeds across the table toward Marcus. Take the Buckhead house. Take the 70% of the liquid assets. Take all of it. I do not care anymore. I just want to be done with you. I just want this over. Marcus's lead attorney did not miss a single beat. He immediately slid the final settlement agreement across the table, tapping a gold pen against the signature line. The agreement formally transferred the Buckhead mansion entirely into Marcus's name, free and clear of any future claims alongside the lion's share of our financial portfolio. I picked up the pen. My hand shook so violently that I had to steady my wrist with my other hand. I signed the documents, leaving tear stains on the heavy legal paper. I pushed the binder back across the table. Judge Hawthorne reviewed the signatures, his expression a mixture of professional detachment and quiet pity. He gathered the documents, stamped them with the official seal of the arbitration court, and picked up his wooden gavel. The settlement is finalized, and binding, the judge declared, the assets will be divided exactly as stipulated in this agreement. The sharp crack of the gavel hitting the sounding block echoed through the room. It was the sound of absolute finality. Marcus let out a long, heavy breath, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms behind his head. He looked at Vivian. Vivian looked back at him. They shared a long, silent look of absolute, arrogant victory. They had won. They had successfully stolen my money, laundered it through a fake company, bought a secret penthouse for my sister, and stripped me of my own home in a court of law. They believed they were the smartest people in the entire world. I stood up slowly, wiping my face with the back of my hand. I packed my generic gray briefcase, zipping it shut with a quiet click. I did not look at my mother. I did not look at my ex-husband. I simply turned and walked out of the conference room, keeping my head down until I reached the elevator banks. The stainless steel doors closed, shutting out the law firm. As the elevator began its descent to the ground floor, my tears vanished instantly. My posture straightened. The trembling in my hands stopped completely. I pulled my phone from my pocket and checked my secure email portal. There was a message from the commercial debt broker in Chicago. The transfer of the $5 million toxic debt from the Shadow Syndicate was officially complete. The title of Apex Solutions Trent's personal guarantees, and every single asset tied to the laundered money, was now legally irrevocably registered to my offshore holding company. Marcus and Vivian had just spent the last hour fighting viciously over the scraps of a marital estate, completely blind to the fact that I was no longer a disgruntled ex-wife. I was now a massive hostile corporate creditor. They thought they had secured their future. They did not realize they had just signed over their entire existence to me. I walked out of the lobby and into the bright Atlanta sunlight. My family wanted a war. Tomorrow morning they were going to get a massacre. I decided to celebrate my invisible monumental victory before unleashing the absolute devastation I had planned for the end of the week. After the stifling theatrical performance in the arbitration room, I needed an environment that reflected my newly acquired power. I chose a corner booth at a notoriously exclusive, dimly lit restaurant in the heart of the financial district. The atmosphere was a symphony of quiet wealth characterized by the soft clinking of crystal, the muted conversations of corporate titans, and the impeccable invisible service of the waitstaff. I ordered a glass of vintage Bordeaux and a light lunch, setting my tablet flat on the white linen tablecloth. I spent the next hour reviewing the digital deed of assignment, tracing the flow of the $5 million shadow loan that Marcus had orchestrated and Trent had so foolishly signed. The legal architecture of their impending ruin was flawless. I owned them. I owned the fake tech startup. I owned Trent's personal guarantees. I owned the real estate purchased with the laundered funds. It was a pristine, weaponized portfolio of debt, and it belonged entirely to me. I took a slow sip of the dark wine, letting the complex flavors settle on my tongue. I was just preparing to ask for the check when the unmistakable shrill pitch of my sister's laughter sliced through the refined ambiance of the dining room. I did not look up immediately. I kept my eyes fixed on my screen, though my peripheral vision easily tracked their approach. Chloe and Trent were being led by the maitre d' toward a premium table near the center of the room. They looked like walking caricatures of newly acquired, unearned wealth. Chloe was wearing a vibrant, ostentatious designer dress that screamed for attention, completely out of place in the understated elegance of the midday lunch crowd. She carried a limited edition Birkin bag tucked under her arm like a trophy. Trent trailed slightly behind her, wearing a sharp tailored blazer over a crisp t-shirt, projecting the exact image of a disruptive Silicon Valley CEO that he had seen in magazines. He walked with a manufactured swagger, completely unaware that he was nothing more than a disposable pawn in a massive federal crime. I intended to ignore them. I had no desire to engage in a public spectacle when I was only 48 hours away from destroying their entire world. But Chloe possessed a radar for my presence, fueled by a lifelong obsession with ensuring I witnessed her perceived superiority. She stopped abruptly in the middle of the aisle. I felt her eyes lock onto my booth. A sharp, predatory smile stretched across her perfectly glossed lips. She tapped Trent on the arm, pointing in my direction, and immediately altered her course to intercept me. Nia, Chloe called out, her voice loud enough to turn the heads of several nearby diners. "What a massive surprise seeing you here!" I slowly locked my tablet screen and looked up, maintaining an expression of mild, polite indifference. "Hello, Chloe." Trent. Trent approached the table, slipping his hands into his pockets and rocking back on his expensive loafers. He looked down at me with an expression of profound, patronizing pity. He had clearly been briefed on the morning's arbitration results. Marcus and Vivian must have called them immediately to brag about how effectively they had stripped me of the Buckhead mansion and the majority of the marital assets. "We heard the news about the settlement this morning," Trent said, his voice dropping into a register of fake solemn sympathy. "Vivian called us right after she left the law firm. It is a tough break, Nia. Truly. But honestly, it is probably for the best. A clean break allows everyone to heal." I stared at him, marveling at the absolute breathtaking irony of the situation. Here was a man who had blindly signed a toxic high-interest $5 million corporate loan engineered by shadow lenders. A man whose name was on the master ledger of a shell company used to launder embezzled funds. A man whose wife was actively sleeping with the architect of the entire scheme. And yet he stood there radiating total superiority, offering me condescending life advice. "I am adjusting," I said smoothly, taking another sip of my wine. Chloe leaned against the edge of my table, bringing her face uncomfortably close to mine. She wanted to twist the knife. She wanted to see the devastation she believed I was hiding. "Well, you really should not be sitting alone in dark restaurants moping," Chloe cooed, her eyes gleaming with malicious delight. "You need to focus on the positive things. Just look at how wonderfully things are turning out for us. Trent has been working so incredibly hard, and his company is just exploding. We are celebrating a massive new milestone today." She dramatically lifted her left hand, placing it flat on the table right next to my tablet. The diamond was blinding. It was a massive, flawless emerald cut stone, surrounded by a halo of smaller diamonds set heavily in platinum. It caught the low light of the restaurant and threw fractured rainbows across the white linen. It was easily a $100,000 piece of jewelry. "Trent insisted on upgrading my ring to match our new lifestyle," Chloe announced, admiring her own hand. The startup just secured another massive round of venture capital funding. The investors are practically throwing money at Trent. It is exhausting managing this kind of growth, but someone has to do it. I looked at the ring, and my mind instantly performed the forensic arithmetic. There was no venture capital funding. There were no legitimate investors. That ring was purchased using the heavily laundered remnants of the offshore accounts Marcus had drained from my portfolio. She was literally wearing the physical manifestation of my stolen labor on her finger. "It is a stunning piece," I said, keeping my tone perfectly even. "You must be very proud of your business acumen, Trent." Trent puffed out his chest, completely oblivious to the lethal sarcasm buried in my compliment. "It is all about aggressive synergy and market disruption, Nia. You have to be willing to take massive risks to secure massive rewards. That is the fundamental difference between building wealth and just auditing it." He leaned closer, resting his hands on the back of a nearby chair, preparing to deliver a lecture. "You know, Nia, I always told Marcus that you worked too hard." Trent continued, his tone shifting from boastful to deeply patronizing. "You spent your entire marriage buried in corporate spreadsheets, chasing partners and managing other people's money. You forgot about family values. You forgot how to be a supportive partner. A woman can have a great career, but if her home is broken and her husband is neglected, what is the actual point of all that ambition?" Marcus is a great guy. He needed warmth. He needed a wife, not a senior managing partner. If you had just prioritized your family instead of your ego, you might not be sitting here alone right now. I felt a genuine cold smile curve the corners of my mouth. He was parroting the exact gaslighting narrative Vivian had deployed in the arbitration room. They had all coordinated their talking points perfectly. "I will certainly keep your relationship advice in mind, Trent," I replied quietly, "especially considering your profound expertise in securing family stability." Trent smiled, satisfied that his lecture had landed successfully. Before he could offer any more profound wisdom, his smartphone began to buzz loudly in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen with an expression of exaggerated self-importance. "Speak of the devil. It is my lead investor." Trent sighed dramatically, holding the phone up for Chloe to see. "I have to take this. They are incredibly needy today. Order us a bottle of the vintage Dom Perignon, babe. I will be right back." Trent turned and walked briskly toward the quiet lobby of the restaurant, pressing the phone to his ear and already utilizing empty corporate buzzwords. The moment Trent was out of earshot, the atmosphere at the table shifted instantly. The fake patronizing sympathy vanished from Chloe's face, replaced by a look of raw, unfiltered venom. The mask dropped completely. She leaned down, bracing both hands on the table, her face inches from mine. The cloying scent of her expensive perfume was suffocating. She wanted the satisfaction of seeing me break. She wanted to drive the final nail into the coffin of my marriage and my pride. "You can drop the brave face, Nia," Chloe whispered, her voice a sharp, triumphant hiss. "Mom told me everything about the arbitration. She told me how you broke down crying and begged Marcus to just take the house and the money. You lost. You lost your husband, you lost your mansion, and you lost your dignity." I maintained eye contact, my expression entirely unreadable. "You know why this happened, do you not?" Chloe continued, a cruel, mocking smile playing on her lips. "You were always the extra one in this family. You were always the cold, boring disappointment who thought a paycheck made you superior. But nobody actually wants you around. You are entirely replaceable. Even your own husband thinks so. Marcus could not wait to get away from you." She paused, letting the words hang in the air, expecting me to shatter, expecting me to flee the restaurant in tears. Instead, I picked up my wine glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip, my eyes never leaving hers. The absolute calmness of my reaction caused a brief, almost imperceptible flicker of confusion to cross her face. I set the glass down gently. I reached out and lightly tapped the massive diamond on her left hand with my index finger. "Be careful what you accept, Chloe," I said, my voice dropping to a soft, razor-sharp whisper that cut directly through the ambient noise of the room. She pulled her hand back defensively, her eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" I picked up my tablet and slid smoothly out of the booth, standing tall so I was looking down at her. I smoothed the lapels of my gray suit. "I am just offering a bit of financial advice to a new member of the high-net-worth community," I said, leaning in close so only she could hear the absolute certainty in my voice. "That beautiful ring, your new lifestyle, Trent's imaginary tech company. It is all built on borrowed time and borrowed capital. And a debt is sometimes much, much more expensive than you think." Chloe scoffed, tossing her hair over her shoulder, attempting to regain her footing. "You are just bitter and jealous. You have absolutely nothing left." I smiled. It was not a fake smile this time. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated anticipation. "Enjoy your champagne, little sister," I said softly. "Drink up while you still can." I turned and walked away, navigating through the elegant dining room with perfectly measured steps. I did not look back to see her reaction. I did not need to. Chloe thought she was wearing a symbol of victory. She did not understand that she was wearing a tracking beacon for a $5 million federal collection warrant. And the bill was coming due much sooner than she could ever comprehend. The Piedmont Country Club was a fortress of old Southern wealth, a sprawling estate of manicured golf courses and velvet-lined ballrooms where Atlanta's elite gathered to display their power. Tonight, it was entirely monopolized by my mother. Vivian was hosting her 35th wedding anniversary gala, an event she had meticulously designed to be the crowning social triumph of her life. The gold-foiled invitations had been dispatched weeks ago to mayors, real estate tycoons, and federal judges. I, of course, was not on the guest list. Vivian had made sure my exclusion was public and exceptionally cruel. She had spent the days following the arbitration seeding whispers through her charity boards and country club luncheons. She painted a tragic picture of a daughter who had lost her mind, a bitter, greedy workaholic who had been rightfully cut out of the family after trying to destroy her generous husband. I was the disgraced outcast, explicitly banned from the premises. Vivian wanted to surround herself with the city's most powerful figures to cement her new reality. She wanted Marcus by her side as the loyal son-in-law, and Chloe sparkling in stolen diamonds, presenting a united, untouchable front. They were celebrating their absolute victory over me. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of my temporary suite in a downtown high-rise, watching the twilight bleed over the city skyline. I held a crystal glass of sparkling water, perfectly calm. The anxiety that had plagued me for the last 2 years was entirely gone. It had been replaced by a cold crystalline focus. My secure phone vibrated on the marble countertop. I set my glass down and picked it up. It was Elias, my lead investigator, and the only person who fully understood the lethal financial architecture I had just constructed. "Tell me you have good news," I said, answering the call. "It is better than good," Nia Elias replied, his voice crackling with professional excitement. "It is a total systemic collapse. They just handed you the final nail." "Explain it to me," I instructed, leaning against the counter. Elias typed rapidly on his keyboard, the sound filtering through the speaker. "Your mother and Marcus have been spending money like it is water since the arbitration. The penthouse, the new cars, the jewelry, and this massive gala tonight. Vivian wanted imported orchids, a Michelin-starred catering team, and top-tier champagne. But Marcus's cash is tied up in the offshore shell accounts, and moving too much of it at once would flag the IRS. So they needed fast, clean liquidity." "Where did they get it?" I asked, already smiling. "They took out a massive short-term luxury credit line against their newly acquired assets," Elias explained, unable to hide his amusement. "Marcus leveraged the Buckhead mansion. And Trent, completely guided by Marcus, pledged the remaining equity in Apex Solutions to back a corporate line of credit for the family's immediate expenses. They cross-collateralized everything." I closed my eyes, savoring the absolute magnitude of their stupidity. They had grown so arrogant, so intoxicated by their perceived victory, that they forgot the cardinal rule of predatory finance. You never leverage an asset you do not truly own. "Because I own the primary $5 million shadow loan on Apex Solutions," I said softly, piecing the final trap together. "Exactly," Elias confirmed. "Your shadow paper has a strict exclusivity covenant. The moment Trent pledged Apex as collateral for a secondary credit line without your permission, it triggered an automatic, irrevocable default on your master loan. The entire $5 million plus penalties is due immediately. And because Marcus used the Buckhead mansion as a cross-guarantee to secure Trent's new credit line, I continued, my heart beating with a steady, lethal rhythm." Elias laughed. "You own the default, Nia. The second you file the notice, you seize Apex Solutions. You seize Trent's personal assets. And you trigger a lien that allows you to foreclose on the Buckhead mansion. The net is completely closed. They have legally bound every single thing they own to the debt you hold. They are bankrupt. Send the default notices to my secure drive I ordered. I want the hard copies printed." "Done," Elias said. "When are you serving them?" I looked at the digital clock on the wall. It was 7 in the evening. The gala was just beginning. The ballroom would be packed with every influential person Vivian had spent her life trying to impress. "Right now," I replied. I ended the call and walked into the master bedroom. Lying perfectly flat on the king-sized bed was my armor for the evening. I was done wearing gray suits. I was done wearing minimal makeup and pulling my hair back to look like the tired, overworked accountant they all believed me to be. If I was going to crash the most exclusive social event of the year, I was going to do it on my own terms. I stepped into a deep, blood-red silk evening gown. It draped perfectly over my frame, featuring a daring slit up the thigh and a low, plunging back. It was not a dress meant for blending in. It was a dress meant to stop traffic. It was unapologetic, aggressive, and fiercely elegant. I left my hair down, letting the dark curls fall freely over my shoulders. I applied a sharp, precise wing of black eyeliner and swiped a bold crimson lipstick across my mouth. I looked in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was a stranger to the family I was about to destroy. She was not a victim. She was not a neglected wife or a disappointing daughter. She was an apex predator. I walked back into the living area and picked up my slim black leather briefcase. It was sleek, professional, and currently housed the most destructive financial documents in the state of Georgia. Inside were the executed deeds of assignment, the immediate notices of default, the proof of Trent's personal guarantee, and a comprehensive, fully documented paper trail of Marcus and Vivian's federal money laundering scheme. It was a briefcase full of pure, concentrated ruin. I grabbed my car keys and walked out of the suite. The ride down the elevator felt painfully slow, my anticipation building with every floor. I handed my ticket to the valet, slipped into the driver's seat of my car, and pulled out into the evening traffic. The drive to the Piedmont Country Club took 20 minutes. I pulled up to the grand sweeping driveway lined with ancient oak trees wrapped in twinkling fairy lights. A fleet of luxury vehicles was already lined up at the valet stand. I stepped out of my car, handing the keys to a stunned attendant who could not take his eyes off the red silk dress. I gripped the handle of my black briefcase. The distant sound of a string quartet floated through the warm night air, mingling with the polite, wealthy laughter of Atlanta's highest society. Vivian was inside holding court, basking in the illusion of her perfect family and her stolen wealth. Marcus was likely shaking hands and networking, playing the charismatic, successful bachelor. Chloe was undoubtedly flashing my money in the faces of anyone who would look. They thought they had buried me. They thought they had written the final chapter of my life. I took a deep breath, the cool night air filling my lungs, and began the long walk up the marble steps toward the glowing golden doors of the ballroom. The hunt was officially on. The heavy brass handles of the ballroom doors felt cold against my palms. I did not knock. I did not wait for an usher. I pushed with both hands, throwing the heavy double doors wide open. They hit the stoppers with a resonant, echoing thud that cut straight through the melodic strains of the string quartet. The sensory shift was immediate. The stifling heat of 100 tightly packed, heavily perfumed bodies hit me. The room was a blinding display of wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over tables draped in white silk, weighed down by towering arrangements of imported white orchids. At the far end of the room, on a raised velvet-lined stage, stood Marcus. He held a microphone in one hand and a flute of vintage champagne in the other. He was mid-sentence, wearing a bespoke tuxedo, flashing that signature charismatic smile. Beside him stood Vivian, glowing under the spotlight, soaking in the admiration of Atlanta's elite. My sudden appearance froze the entire room. The string quartet hit a discordant note and stopped playing entirely. Marcus lowered his microphone, his smile sliding off his face like wet clay. Vivian stared at me, her eyes widening in genuine, unfiltered shock. The elite crowd parted slightly, creating a clear, unobstructed path between the entrance and the stage. I stood framed in the doorway, the blood-red silk of my dress standing out violently against the sea of muted conservative evening wear. Elias stepped up right behind me, carrying a stack of thick black leather dossiers. I began to walk. My heels clicked sharply against the polished hardwood floor, the sound echoing in the sudden suffocating silence. I did not look at the whispers erupting around me. I kept my eyes locked dead on the stage. Vivian was the first to snap out of her paralysis. Her shock morphed instantly into visceral, unhinged rage. Her perfectly curated high society persona disintegrated in a fraction of a second. "Call security!" Vivian shrieked, her voice shrill and echoing through the ballroom microphone Marcus had just dropped. "Someone call the guards right now, drag her out of here. She is not on the guest list." Two burly security guards in dark suits moved hesitantly from the perimeter, stepping into my path. I did not break my stride. I reached into my black briefcase, pulled out a court-stamped injunction, and shoved it directly into the chest of the lead guard. "Federal collection warrant." I said, my voice dangerously low and absolutely steady. "Interfere with me and you will be arrested for obstructing a federal asset seizure. Step aside." The guard looked in the heavy red seal, his eyes widening, and immediately backed away, pulling his partner with him. I reached the center of the ballroom. The absolute pinnacle of Atlanta society surrounded me. Mayors, real estate tycoons, and federal judges were staring in rapt, horrified fascination. I turned slightly and gave Elias a single sharp nod. Elias moved with practiced, frictionless efficiency. He walked straight to the VIP tables at the front of the room, the ones occupied by the most powerful investors and socialites in the city. With a series of sharp, deliberate motions, he slammed a black dossier onto each table. The heavy binders hit the crystal glasses, sloshing champagne onto the pristine white tablecloths. "What is the meaning of this?" a prominent bank executive demanded, staring at the dossier that had just landed next to his plate. I turned to face the entire room, projecting my voice so it carried clearly to the very back of the hall without the need for a microphone. "Good evening, everyone," I announced, my tone razor-sharp and devoid of any emotion. "Please accept my apologies for the interruption. I am not here to celebrate a marital milestone. I am here representing the primary corporate creditor. I am here to formally collect on outstanding defaulted assets. The murmurs escalated into a chaotic roar. Vivian's face drained of all color, turning a sickly ashen gray. Marcus stood entirely paralyzed on the stage, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. He looked completely stripped of his arrogant armor. But Trent, ever the fool, could not handle the blow to his fragile ego. He pushed his way through the crowd from a nearby table, his face flushed red with alcohol and manufactured rage. Chloe trailed behind him, looking panicked and confused. Trent lunged into the open space, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "Are you insane?" Trent bellowed, trying to project the alpha male dominance he had spent months faking. "You have completely lost your mind, Nia. Security. Get this crazy woman out of here before I throw her out myself. You cannot just walk in here and ruin my family's event with your bitter, jealous delusions." I turned my head slowly, locking my gaze onto Trent. The absolute frigid deadliness in my eyes stopped him dead in his tracks. He froze, his hand still suspended in the air, suddenly realizing he had walked directly into a trap he could not comprehend. "Shut up, Trent," I said. The words cracked like a physical whip across the silent room. I took one step toward him, closing the distance, forcing him to look down at me. "Do you actually think your tech company still exists?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet, but carrying a lethal, echoing weight. "Do you honestly believe you are a CEO?" Trent blinked, his mouth dropping open. "What are you talking about?" I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the master ledger. I held it up right in front of his face. "I just bought your $5 million debt," I stated, enunciating every single syllable with crushing clarity. "The shadow syndicate you so blindly signed with, they sold your paper to me. I own Apex Solutions. I own every single asset tied to your fraudulent laundered venture capital." Trent took a stumbling step backward, shaking his head. "No, that is impossible. Marcus handled the financing. Marcus said it was secure." "Marcus lied to you," I replied, my voice slicing through his denial. "Marcus used your fake company to launder stolen marital assets, and he used your personal guarantee to secure a massive credit line to pay for this absurd party tonight. And because you pledged an asset you did not truly own, you triggered an automatic default on the master loan." I watched the realization hit him. I watched the blood completely leave his face. I watched the fake, arrogant facade absolutely shatter, leaving nothing but a terrified, ruined little boy. "The luxury penthouse you live in?" I continued, my voice relentless, hammering the final nails into his coffin. "The expensive sports car you drove here tonight? Every single dime in your corporate accounts. They were all legally seized by my holding company at 6 o'clock this morning. You are entirely bankrupt, Trent. You own absolutely nothing." Trent turned to stone. His arms fell limply to his sides. He looked back at Marcus on the stage, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading terror, but Marcus was staring at the floor, completely defeated. Chloe let out a sharp, genuine scream of horror, clutching her diamond ring, as if I were about to rip it straight off her finger. The echo of Chloe's scream hung in the heavy, perfumed air of the ballroom. It was the exact frequency of a shattered illusion. The high society crowd, previously murmuring in polite confusion, fell into a breathless collective hush. Marcus violently snapped out of his paralysis. His survival instincts kicked in, fueled by pure desperation and the terrifying realization that his entire elite network was watching his public execution. He lunged toward the edge of the stage, waving his arms frantically at the security detail huddled near the exit. "Guards!" Marcus shouted, his voice cracking, entirely devoid of its usual smooth baritone. "I said, remove this woman immediately. She is trespassing." He turned back to the crowd, smoothing the front of his bespoke tuxedo with shaking hands, pasting on a ghastly, strained smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am so deeply sorry for this disruption. My ex-wife has suffered a complete mental break. These are the ravages of a bitter divorce. She is deeply unwell and creating a scene. Please just ignore her." I did not stop walking. I ignored his pathetic blustering and bypassed the stunned guests climbing the 3 velvet-lined steps onto the stage. Marcus tried to step into my path, trying to physically block me from the center of the platform. I did not break my stride. I stepped directly into his personal space, my posture radiating such absolute icy authority that he instinctively flinched and stepped back. I reached out and ripped the microphone straight from his sweating grip. The speakers whined with a sharp burst of feedback before I adjusted my hold, killing the noise. I stood at the exact center of the stage, looking out over the sea of Atlanta's most powerful figures. "I am not crazy, Marcus," I announced, my voice booming through the ballroom's state-of-the-art sound system, echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "But I am absolutely ruthless when it comes to financial fraud." I turned my back on the crowd for a fraction of a second to look at Marcus. He was sweating profusely now, his eyes darting toward the exits. I turned back to the audience, my gaze landing on Trent, who was still standing frozen near the front tables, looking like a man who had just watched his entire life burn to the ground. "My ex-husband claims to be a financial visionary," I said, keeping my tone crisp and conversational as if I were delivering a keynote address at a banking conference. "He recently bragged to his esteemed colleagues about a massive capital investment he made into his brother-in-law's tech startup. $3 million to be exact. A very generous, highly publicized family investment." I looked directly at Trent. "Tell me, Trent, did you ever actually see a single cent of that $3 million? Trent looked up, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. He swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper, though the absolute silence of the room carried it. He handled the vendor contracts. He bought the servers overseas. I smiled. It was a cold, devastating smile. He handled the vendors. How incredibly convenient. I reached into my black leather briefcase and pulled out a small remote clicker. Vivian had spent thousands of dollars installing a massive ceiling to floor digital projector screen behind the stage. She had planned to use it to play a looping, sentimental video montage of her perfect 35-year marriage. I pointed the clicker at the receiver and pressed the button. The screen hummed to life, illuminating the entire stage in a bright, harsh white light. But instead of sepia-toned wedding photographs, a massive high-definition financial spreadsheet materialized. It was a forensic auditor's masterpiece, color-coded, heavily cited, and entirely undeniable. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Several banking executives sitting at the VIP tables physically leaned forward, their trained eyes immediately recognizing the format of a federal tracing document. "Let us trace that $3 million investment together," I narrated, acting as the ultimate tour guide to their destruction. "Here is the initial withdrawal from our joint marital portfolio executed by Marcus. Here's the transfer landing briefly in the Apex Solutions corporate account. But look closely. It does not stay in Trent's company. It immediately bounces into an offshore shell company registered in the Cayman Islands." I clicked the remote again. The screen zoomed in, highlighting a bold red line that connected the offshore account back to the United States. "And here is the final destination of those funds," I said, my voice cutting through the rising, furious murmurs of the crowd. "The deed of trust for a luxury penthouse in Midtown Atlanta. A pristine $4 million piece of real estate purchased entirely in cash, utilizing the $3 million completely washed through Trent's fake company." I clicked the remote one final time. The screen shifted to display the official notarized property deed. The text was blown up massively, impossible to miss. I turned to face my sister. Chloe was shrinking backward into the crowd, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute suffocating terror. "And the sole owner listed on the deed to that secret penthouse?" I asked, letting the question hang in the air for a devastating second. "Chloe." The ballroom erupted. The polite, muted whispers of high society instantly transformed into a chaotic uproar. Federal judges were pulling out their phones. Real estate tycoons were shaking their heads in disgust. They were looking at raw, documented evidence of systemic embezzlement and money laundering, orchestrated by the man standing on the stage and the family hosting the gala. Vivian completely lost her mind. The perfectly curated facade of the dignified matriarch shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She charged toward the stage, her high heels catching on the heavy fabric of her expensive gown, nearly tripping her. She looked feral, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. Lies, Vivian screamed, her voice tearing through the ambient noise of the crowd. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at my face. It is all fabricated. She is a fraud. Turn that screen off right now. Someone cut the power. She forged those documents out of spite to ruin my anniversary. Do not look at that screen. Marcus was backing away from me, his hands raised defensively, trying desperately to salvage a reputation that had already turned to ash. It is a complete fabrication, he stammered, his eyes darting frantically across the furious faces of his former mentors and colleagues. She hacked my secure accounts. She is manipulating the data. I will sue you for everything you have left, Nia. I will destroy you. But Trent was not looking at the screen. He was not looking at Vivian screaming at the base of the stage. He was looking directly at his wife. Chloe was completely unable to meet his eyes. Her face was flushed dark red with guilt, her entire body trembling as she tried to hide behind a towering floral arrangement. Trent turned his head slowly. He looked at Marcus. The realization hit Trent with the devastating force of a freight train. The pieces slammed together in his mind. He had not just lost his imaginary tech company. He had not just lost his car, his savings, and his pride. He had been used. Marcus had manipulated him into signing toxic loans and acting as a disposable shield, all so Marcus could illegally funnel millions of dollars to buy a secret, luxurious love nest for Trent's own wife. A low, guttural sound erupted from Trent's chest. It was a roar of pure, primal, blinding agony. Trent shoved violently past a terrified waiter, sending a tray of champagne flutes shattering against the marble floor. He vaulted onto the velvet-lined stage with a burst of homicidal adrenaline. Marcus saw him coming and tried to turn and run toward the backstage exit, but he was not fast enough. Trent hit him like a runaway truck. The sheer force of the impact lifted Marcus entirely off his feet. The two men crashed violently into the heavy metal microphone stand, sending it clattering across the hardwood stage with an ear-piercing screech of electronic feedback that caused half the ballroom to cover their ears. Trent straddled Marcus on the floor, grabbing him by the lapels of his ruined bespoke tuxedo. Trent hauled Marcus halfway off the floor, his face contorted in absolute uncontrollable rage, his fist pulling back as the entire elite foundation of the Piedmont Country Club dissolved into total irredeemable chaos. The sound of Trent's fist connecting with Marcus's jaw echoed like a gunshot through the microphone that lay discarded on the stage. The two men rolled across the polished hardwood, tangling in a mess of torn silk lapels and spilled champagne. Marcus desperately tried to shield his face, thrashing wildly, but Trent was fueled by the blinding explosive adrenaline of a man who had just realized his entire existence was a carefully constructed joke. Security guards finally rushed the stage, their heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. It took 3 grown men to pry Trent off his victim. They dragged Trent backward, his chest heaving, his face splattered with blood from Marcus's split lip. Marcus lay on his back, gasping for air, holding a hand over his rapidly swelling eye. The ballroom was an absolute pandemonium. Wealthy socialites were screaming. Corporate executives were shouting for the police. It was a spectacular, violent collapse of high society decorum. I stood perfectly still, watching the violence unfold with cold detachment. I did not flinch. I simply bent down my red silk dress, pooling beautifully around my ankles, and picked up the microphone Marcus had dropped. I tapped the microphone twice. The sharp, booming sound cut through the screaming, instantly forcing the room back into a breathless, terrified silence. "You all think the financial fraud is the worst of it," I announced, my voice completely devoid of pity, ringing out over the heads of Atlanta's elite. "You think stealing $3 million to buy a secret penthouse is the ultimate betrayal, but you underestimate the absolute moral bankruptcy of my family." I turned toward the massive digital projector screen looming behind the stage. I raised the remote clicker in my hand. "Let us look at what they were actually doing inside that $4 million property," I said. I pressed the button. The financial spreadsheet vanished. In its place, crisp, high-definition security camera footage filled the massive screen. It was the living room of the Midtown penthouse. The timestamp in the corner indicated it was recorded less than a month ago, right in the middle of my arbitration proceedings. The entire ballroom let out a synchronized, horrified gasp. On the screen, Marcus and Chloe were hopelessly tangled together on a custom velvet sofa. They were kissing hungrily, their hands roaming over each other with the frantic, disgusting familiarity of long-term lovers. The visual was undeniable. It was undeniable proof of incestuous betrayal broadcast in 10-foot-tall resolution. But the visual was not the grand finale, the audio was. I had pulled the hidden security feed that Marcus was too arrogant to realize he was broadcasting to a cloud server I had already subpoenaed. The audio crackled to life, filling the country club with the sharp, calculating, unmistakable voice of my mother. Vivian walked into the frame of the video carrying a shopping bag from an exclusive baby boutique. She looked down at Marcus and Chloe, completely unbothered by their intimacy. In fact, she smiled. "You need to finalize the arbitration this week," Vivian's voice boomed from the overhead speakers, her tone dripping with venomous greed. "Drain every single account Nia has left. Strip her bare. Chloe needs that capital to secure the trust fund for the baby she is carrying. It is your child, Marcus. You have to protect your own bloodline. Nia is completely useless to us now. Take her money and finish this." The silence in the ballroom was so absolute, so profoundly suffocating, that you could hear the crystal chandeliers softly chiming in the air currents. The Atlanta elite did not just gasp, they recoiled. This was not a simple white-collar crime anymore. This was a dark, twisted generational sickness. This was a mother actively plotting to bankrupt her own daughter to fund an affair that resulted in a bastard child. The shock broke and the crowd went completely feral. Every single mayor, judge, and real estate tycoon in the room simultaneously reached into their designer pockets and purses. Hundreds of smartphone screens lit up the dim ballroom like a constellation of stars. They were recording the screen. They were recording Marcus bleeding on the floor. They were recording Vivian. The highest echelon of Atlanta society was live-streaming the absolute destruction of the Wilson family. On the stage, the guards holding Trent suddenly lost their grip. Trent had stopped struggling. He stood perfectly still, staring up at the massive screen, listening to the words echoing through the room. "The baby she is carrying. It is your child." Trent turned his head slowly. He looked down at Chloe, who was kneeling on the floor near the front tables, her hands clutching her stomach. She was sobbing hysterically, her perfect makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She reached a trembling hand out toward him, begging him silently to stop, to understand. Trent looked at her with a revulsion so deep it looked physically painful. He realized the child he had been preparing to raise, the baby they had celebrated, was the product of his wife sleeping with her own brother-in-law. Trent let out a sound that was not entirely human. He spun around, broke entirely free from the distracted security guards, and lunged at Marcus one final time. Marcus barely had time to raise his hands before Trent's fist connected squarely with his jaw. The crack of bone was sickeningly loud. Marcus's eyes rolled back in his head and he slumped backward against the wooden floorboards, knocked completely unconscious. Chloe shrieked, burying her face in her hands, collapsing onto the expensive Persian rug in a pathetic, weeping heap. She was completely broken, stripped of her fake wealth, her marriage, and her stolen dignity. And then there was Vivian. My mother stood frozen near the edge of the stage. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of her social execution had finally short-circuited her brain. She looked out at the sea of flashing cameras. She saw the women she had played tennis with for decades covering their mouths in disgust. She saw the charity board members pointing at her with blatant contempt. There was no recovering from this. There was no spin, no lie, and no manipulation that could ever fix what had just been broadcast. She was socially dead. She was a pariah. She would be a laughingstock in every country club across the eastern seaboard by morning. The panic hit her physical body. Vivian let out a ragged, wheezing gasp. She clutched her hands desperately to the center of her chest, her manicured fingers digging into the fabric of her expensive gown. Her face turned a terrifying shade of purple, her eyes bulging as she struggled to draw air into her lungs. "Help me!" Vivian choked out, stumbling forward, reaching her hand out toward the VIP tables. "Please!" Not a single person moved. The women who had smiled and drank champagne with her only an hour ago actively took a step backward, pulling their silk dresses away from her as if she were carrying a plague. The men she had tried to impress looked at her with cold, unblinking disdain. They watched her suffocate under the weight of her own monstrous ego. Vivian's knees buckled. She collapsed onto the floor, landing hard on the polished wood. She lay there, gasping, her meticulously styled hair coming undone, her heavy gold jewelry clattering against the stage. She looked up at the ceiling, utterly alone in a room filled with hundreds of people. I looked down at the wreckage of my bloodline. Marcus was unconscious and bleeding. Trent was being dragged away by security, his life completely ruined. Chloe was sobbing uncontrollably on the floor, utterly disgraced. And my mother was lying helpless, destroyed by the very high society she had worshipped her entire life. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. I felt nothing but a clean, sweeping sense of absolute justice. I lowered the microphone and set it gently on the edge of the stage. I reached down and picked up my black leather briefcase. I turned my back on the projector screen, the flashing cameras, and the ruined, miserable remnants of my family. I walked down the steps of the stage, moving with the same steady, perfectly measured grace I had entered with. The crowd parted for me instantly. They stepped aside, lowering their phones, looking at me with a mixture of absolute shock and profound, undeniable respect. I was no longer the discarded daughter. I was the architect of the greatest reckoning this city had ever seen. I pushed through the heavy brass doors and stepped out into the cool, quiet Atlanta night. The air tasted incredibly sweet. My hunt was over. I had won. The fallout from the Piedmont Country Club gala was not merely a local social scandal. It was a spectacular, highly publicized legal slaughter. The heavy black dossiers Elias had distributed to the VIP tables were not just left behind. They were immediately handed over to the authorities by the very bankers, judges, and investors Vivian had spent her entire life trying to impress. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with the radioactive fraud my family had committed. Within 48 hours, the FBI raided Marcus's corporate law offices and the Midtown penthouse simultaneously. I watched the breaking news on the television in my suite as federal agents carried out dozens of boxes of financial records and seized computer servers. They dragged Marcus out in handcuffs during the peak of the morning rush hour. He was wearing the same clothes he had worn to the gala, his face bruised and swollen from Trent's punch, looking completely disheveled as the local news cameras flashed in his face. The charges were staggering. Wire fraud, massive money laundering, and operating unlicensed offshore shell companies. Because of the immaculate financial tracking Elias and I provided, the evidence was airtight. Marcus was denied bail, immediately deemed a severe flight risk due to the Cayman Islands accounts I had already frozen. Trent moved with a ruthless, self-serving speed born of utter humiliation and panic. The morning after the gala, he filed for an expedited fault-based divorce. He literally packed Chloe's expensive designer clothes into black plastic garbage bags and threw them onto the sidewalk outside their luxury apartment complex. But Trent did not stop there. To save himself from federal prison, he immediately turned state's evidence against Marcus. He handed over every email, every text message, and every fake vendor contract Marcus had ever sent him. In doing so, he left Chloe completely exposed. Because Marcus had used Chloe's name on the deed to the secret penthouse and tied her to the laundered funds, she was legally drowning in millions of dollars of toxic debt. She was facing an impending federal indictment as a co-conspirator with zero financial resources to hire a defense attorney. As for my mother, her descent was the steepest and the most public. The bank, acting on the default notices I had triggered the night of the gala, moved to foreclose on the Buckhead mansion before the week was over. Federal marshals arrived at the iron gates early on a Thursday morning. Vivian tried to order them off the property, screaming about her social standing and threatening to call the mayor. Instead, she was escorted out of her own home in her silk pajamas. Federal agents seized her imported cars, froze her personal accounts, and confiscated her stolen jewelry to pay off the massive luxury credit lines Marcus had secured against her name. She went from holding court in velvet ballrooms to being entirely penniless and homeless in a matter of days. The Atlanta gossip columns dedicated entire front pages to her spectacular downfall, treating her ruin as the ultimate cautionary tale. I sat at the massive oak desk in my new corner office at the top of a downtown skyscraper. I was now the sole owner and CEO of Apex Solutions, systematically clearing out the rot Marcus had installed and turning the tech firm into a legitimate, highly profitable powerhouse. I wore a sharp tailored navy suit, sipping a cup of black coffee, watching the city skyline gleam under the bright morning sun. The air in my office was perfectly quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos I had left behind. My secure private line vibrated on the glass surface of my desk. I looked at the caller ID. It was an unregistered unknown number. I pressed the answer button, put the phone on speaker, and leaned back in my leather chair, waiting in total silence. Nia. The voice was ragged, weak, and completely broken. It was Vivian. The imperious, commanding, arrogant tone of the grand matriarch was entirely gone. It had been replaced by the pathetic, trembling whimper of a thoroughly defeated woman. "I am listening," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Nia, please." Vivian sobbed, the sound of a passing semi-truck and a blaring siren wailing in the background of her call. "We have nothing. I am calling from a payphone outside a rundown motel off the interstate. The police locked the mansion. The bank took everything. We do not even have money for basic groceries. I had to beg the motel manager for an extra hour in this filthy room." I watched the clouds drift lazily across the bright blue sky outside my window, entirely unmoved by her tears. "You have to help us," Vivian begged, her voice cracking into a desperate, hysterical pitch. "I know you are angry. I know what we did to you was wrong. But Chloe is pregnant. She is sleeping on a dirty motel floor, crying all day. Trent left her with a mountain of debt. He threw her out on the street. And Marcus is sitting in a federal holding cell. You have all the money, Nia. You took the companies. You seized the accounts. You have the power to stop the collections and fix this. Please, you have to save your sister and the unborn baby. We are starving." I let her frantic, pathetic cries echo through the quiet office for a long moment. I felt no satisfaction, no joy, and absolutely no pity. The woman begging on the other end of the line was a stranger to me. She was a parasite who had finally run out of hosts. "I already yielded 70% of the marital assets to you, Mother," I said, my tone chillingly calm, precise, and perfectly still. "I gave you exactly what you fought so hard to steal during the arbitration." Vivian choked on a heavy sob. "Nia, please, I am begging you. It is just a terrible shame that those assets came securely attached to $10 million in toxic bad debt and federal indictments." I continued, my voice steady and absolute, slicing through her tears. "You wanted to build a legacy on stolen ground. Now you get to live in the ruins. I wish you and Chloe a very happy life rebuilding from the ground up." I ended the call and permanently blocked the number. I set the phone face down on the desk. The office was bright, serene, and entirely mine. The past was finally buried and my future was a clean, unwritten slate. The hours slipped by in absolute, undisturbed peace. The chaotic noise of my past was finally and permanently silenced. I sat at my desk as the bright morning sun tracked across the sky, slowly yielding to the deep, bruised purple of twilight. The transition was seamless. By the time the shadows stretched completely across my office floor, the sprawling metropolis of Atlanta had transformed. The skyline ignited a glittering grid of gold and white lights, pulsing with raw electric energy in the dark. I stood up from my leather chair. The silence in the room was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was the pure, unadulterated silence of total ownership. I walked over to the sleek, modern bar cart resting against the far wall of the office. I picked up a heavy crystal decanter and poured a generous measure of vintage red wine. The liquid caught the ambient light of the city, glowing with the exact same deep blood-red hue as the silk dress I had worn to my mother's ruined anniversary gala. It was a fitting tribute to a flawless execution. Holding the crystal glass, I walked across the plush carpet toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. I stopped inches from the glass, looking down at the city stretching out endlessly beneath me. I was no longer looking up at the world from the bottom of a dark, suffocating well. I was standing at the absolute pinnacle, looking down at the empire I had seized. Down there somewhere in the tangled maze of highways and flickering streetlights, Marcus was sitting in a stark concrete federal holding cell. He was trading his bespoke tailored suits for a fluorescent orange jumpsuit stripped of his charm, his status, and his freedom. Down there, Trent was drowning in a sea of aggressive litigation, stripped of his unearned pride and his stolen wealth, facing a lifetime of answering for another man's crimes. Chloe was learning how to navigate the brutal, unforgiving reality of sudden poverty, carrying a child born of a sick betrayal, utterly alone. And Vivian, the grand architect of my lifelong misery, was shivering in a cheap roadside motel room. She was finally experiencing the terrifying, paralyzing vulnerability she had so effortlessly and callously inflicted on me for decades. They had spent my entire life trying to convince me that I was small. They had conditioned me to believe that my worth was defined entirely by their approval. They demanded that my purpose was to serve as the invisible, silent foundation for their glittering, fraudulent lives. They had weaponized the very concept of family, turning it into a specialized tool for extraction, manipulation, and control. I took a slow, deep breath. The conditioned air in my office was crisp and clean. The crushing weight of their expectations, their psychological warfare, and their endless parasitic demands was completely gone. I had not just pruned the branches of their toxic influence, I had ripped the entire infection out by the root. I turned away from this window. I turned my gaze away from the glittering city skyline and looked directly forward. I looked straight into the lens, breaking the invisible barrier of the room, speaking directly to the audience watching. A slow, deliberate smile touched the corners of my mouth. It was not a smile of joy, but one of absolute terrifying clarity. They considered me the black sheep, I said, my voice smooth, resonant, and echoing with unyielding authority. They thought they could use bloodlines to bind me and steal my blood, sweat, and tears. I shifted the crystal glass in my hand, watching the red wine swirl smoothly against the curved edges. They thought they could drain me dry and leave me buried in the dirt. But they forgot the ultimate rule of money. I locked eyes with the camera, my gaze piercing and utterly ruthless. Numbers never lie. I stated the absolute truth of the words hanging heavily in the quiet room. And the one who holds the numbers holds your life. I raised the crystal glass of red wine in a silent, mocking toast to the ghosts of my past. I brought the rim to my lips and took a slow, savoring sip of the dark, rich vintage, cut to black.